Hi there. Welcome to what we will call Studio V. This is the Toothpickings webcast. It is going to be a series of interviews with people who really know their stuff when it comes to vampires and the undead. My name is Brian. I blog under Toothpickings. I've never used my face before in any of my blogs or social media, so if you're seeing me for the first time, I will give you a moment to adjust to this reality. We can all be disappointed together. My first guest is Jonathan Maberry, multi-talented, multi-award winning. He has won 7 Bram Stoker Awards across different categories, young adult, graphic novel, fiction and nonfiction. The Cryptopedia was one of his first big award winners, Rotten Ruin, Bad Blood. And if you like television more than you like graphic novels, there's an adaptation of one of his graphic novels called V-Wars. Came out on Netflix towards the end of 2019, and wasn't that prescient. If you already seen the series, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And we're also going to get into the irony of what is going on in the world right now compared to Jonathan's current work and how the two are almost yin and yang with each other. It's kind of mind-blowing. If you're watching this far into the future and you're not quite making sense of some of the timely references we're making, ask somebody about what happened in 2020 and why we all had to stay home, why I'm doing this from Studio V, my basement, and Jonathan has to do it from his office instead of having a face-to-face interview. With that, let's meet Jonathan. Thank you so much for being here and doing this. And let me just dive into some questions I'd love to ask you about your career and about your insight on vampires and horror and all things having to do with that.
Sure.
You started your career doing nonfiction and fictionalized nonfiction. I shouldn't say start, because you were doing some martial arts books before you got into horror, right?
Right. The way it started is I started doing magazine features back when I was in college in '78, and so I did magazine features most of my adult life as part-time work. You know, my day jobs varied between bodyguard, bouncer, jiu-jitsu master, college teacher. You know, that was my day job. So when I started, like late in that phase, in the late 1990s, early 2000s. I'd had a 4-book deal with a small press to do. 3 of them were martial arts books, and the 4th had been undefined. So I pitched a book on vampire folklore, the Vampire Slayer's Field Guide to the Undead. And my publisher, unfortunately, was so freaked out by a martial arts writer wanting to write that he had me write it under a pen name, Shane MacDougall. Shane being Scottish for John, and MacDougall is one of the family clans I'm associated with in Scotland. And so I did that, and then later on under my own name, did 4 other nonfiction books, 4 on the folklore of supernatural monsters, and 1 pop culture book on the forensics of how the real world would react and respond to zombies. So it was my transition into writing horror, from going from nonfiction, writing about monsters, to then I started writing novels about monsters in 2006.
I want to ask you more about the research you did for those nonfiction books, but first, I'm just kind of curious: were vampires and the undead something you always had a fascination with, or did the idea of it appeal to you, and then you started learning about it?
No, it was something that was always of interest to me. My grandmother was you know the character Luna Lovegood from Harry Potter?
Oh, sure.
Right. Imagine her as an old lady, and you got my grandmother.
Okay.
Believed in everything, absolutely believed in everything. So she, you know, when I was a kid, she was telling me all about them, you know, ghosts and goblins and hinky punks and church grims and red caps. So I grew up with a great love and knowledge of folklore.
It seems to happen a lot that horror writers can trace back to someone they knew young, a nanny, a grandmother, a mom or an aunt who was telling them stories when they were very young about spooky things in the dark.
Well,
have you noticed that too, or is it it's just isolated?
No, and we do it to our kids now. I mean, we create a lot of scary stories for kids. In fact, that series of books, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, Alvin Schwartz, you know, that was aimed at younger kids. I am editing the anthology, the tribute anthology, which comes out in September. But yeah, we love telling stories to kids. Kids like spooky ghost stories and campfire stories and so on, because in those stories they confront things that make them afraid, and usually they beat it somehow. They escape it. They figure it out, or so on. So it's part of the problem solving that we teach our kids, but at the same time we make it fun, because if it was just a problem to solve, that would be boring pretty quickly. But make it running away from a vampire or dealing with a werewolf becomes a lot more fun to figure out how to solve that problem, how to think their way through it, and discover what courage they think they might have in that situation.
Do you think that the stories that the younger generation is going to tell when they're older is going to be different because we're telling fewer vampire and werewolf stories and more supernatural, more stories along the scary stories to tell in the dark breed?
Yeah, I unfortunately I think some of the classic tropes of horror will become less important to kids in the next generation. I mean, the kids growing up in this generation, what is a vampire who maybe in the course of a book will kill 2 or 3 people, compared to a religious group that flies a plane into a tower, or white militia guys who go into a school and kill people? I mean, there are different things that make us afraid. So I'm not sure those scary stories would be as scary to the next generation of kids. They might be interesting, kind of like Star Wars, but with fangs, so it's has a little bit of excitement to it, but I don't think it's going to scare them the same way. And I think the monsters will change. Plus, we're tapping a lot more into urban legends and also monsters from around the world. I mean, we had the rise of Japanese, Chinese, and Korean horror films. Mm-hmm. We're seeing a lot of stuff come over from Norway and Denmark. Some international types of horror that are making themselves known here, and they're not the standard vampire werewolf.
Put a pin in that, because I think we'll be circling back to that by the end of this. But let me ask you a little bit more about your very early nonfiction work and some of the research you did for that.
Sure. First, there are a lot of resources to build a framework of all the different species of vampires around the world. There are hundreds of different species. There's plenty of websites and books. J. Gordon Melton's book is one that comes to mind.
Right up there.
Yeah.
Somewhere.
The books by Brad Steiger, and there's a number of really good books out there. David Scalzi. David Scalzi, did one. David Scull, right? There's a number of those books out there, but I use them as a starting point. So, for example, when I was talking about zombies, I didn't want to just regurgitate what everyone else has been saying about them. So I did things like I reached out to Wade Davis, the ethnobotanist who had gone down to Haiti to figure out how the pharmacokinetics of the zombie potion actually worked, and he did figure it out. It was the tetrodotoxin from the pufferfish, oils from a tree frog, and so on. So I reached out to him by going to the National Geo website. He had written the book Serpent and the Rainbow. That was a legend,
sure.
Very seminal work. But everyone quotes Serpent and the Rainbow. I know he had done works since. So what I did is I contacted him through his office, which he was a speaker for Nat Geo. I went to the Nat Geo page, went through their PR people, and he said I was researching a nonfiction book. Could I ask him some questions? And 40 minutes later, I'm talking to him on the phone. And what's interesting is he does not want to be quoted for Serpent and the Rainbow. The book he did next, and some of the other papers he published next, are more accurate. But nobody quotes those because Serpent and the Rainbow was turned into a bad horror film. So I like talking to actual living experts, and I do that a lot. I call folklore departments all over the world or email them and say, hey, I'm researching a particular vampire subspecies or werewolf subspecies in your culture. Can you give me some information? Folklorists, they have the best information.
Sure.
Because they may have built an entire doctoral thesis on one little specific subtype of vampire. Well, that's the sort of thing you don't see in most books. So I talked to those guys and got their information for my book. And it's a skill set I learned when I was doing magazine features.
Fast forwarding many years, you used a lot of that information, I suspect, in V-Wars when you wanted to have different vampires from different places inhabit the traits of whatever that regional folklore was.
Exactly. The difference between what I was doing for my nonfiction books and what we did for V-Wars is in V-Wars, the vampires are not supernatural at all. It's a genetic disorder,
Mm-hmm.
but there are still different species of vampires around the world. So, different genetic combinations that present with different sets of symptoms that, make them identify them as this type of vampire they are. Horns and fangs, or sometimes it's a driving craving for blood. Other times it's something that they can control. And there are parallels in world cultures for different types of vampires. Not all vampires are evil, by the way, in world culture. Only a third of world culture vampires drink blood. So, by using that, it makes it look like I'm inventing new forms, but actually I'm not. I'm showing that the world is already this varied in its cultural presentations of the different types of monsters that we or our ancestors used to fear.
Who's got time for that kind of world building when you've already got it built for you and you can just use it?
Yeah, truth is stranger in fiction.
Did you rely on a lot of that same kind of research when you were doing the Cryptopedia, or did you go a different direction?
Yeah, the 4 books that I did that were supernatural after I started doing them under my own name, Vampire Universe, They Bite, Cryptopedia, and Wanted Undead or Alive, all follow the same thing. We did a lot of research with experts. Though as that series went on, we also started moving more into pop culture. So we interviewed Stan Lee and John Carpenter and people like that to get their takes on it, plus dozens and dozens of actors and writers, because we wanted their take on why they write this sort of thing and what they've researched and so on. Now with Zombie CSU, it was different though, because these were not folkloric monsters. The zombie, as we interpret it, the flesh-eating ghoul, is a wholly fictional construct. Even though there are similarities in folklore, the George Romero version is a fictional construct. So what we did there is I talked to 250 experts in different fields, from first responder EMTs all the way up to the press, the clergy, and so on how the real world would react and respond. And what was fun there is every single person I interviewed, no matter what field they were in, had already thought about how zombies would play out in their real world. So I talked to, a coroner, and he's like, "Oh yeah, we were talking about this after whatever movie came out. Is if we were dissecting somebody or doing a post-mortem and somebody opened their eyes, what would we do?" That's the sort of stuff that was great. They were doing their research for me and sharing their stories. It made the book really, really popular. It's actually about to come back out again, Zombie CSU.
I feel like there was a few years ago the NIH did some sort of zombie preparedness public awareness campaign.
It was the CDC.
It was the CDC. But brilliant, because everyone wants to pay attention to that. But in so doing, they were teaching a lesson.
Yes.
That would be very much useful today, probably.
Yes, and FEMA continues to do stuff like that. They do a lot of their regional workshops on disaster preparedness using either the zombie plague or some other disaster, because those concepts are easy to grasp. Mm-hmm. A zombie, what you've seen enough zombie movies, zombie shows to understand what that looks like. So how do we survive in the best possible way? That becomes the information that is either the CDC one or the FEMA one. It's telling people how to be practical, but also cooperate with one another, to be problem solvers rather than reactive, and panicky. And it's actually a great way of teaching people how to survive in crisis situations. I think that's why there's been a lot of jokes during the current, isolation with COVID, where people are, one step away from boarding, boards up, nailing boards crookedly across their windows and, shooting people in the head when they come near the house, But I think they know how to survive a zombie apocalypse pretty well.
Well, I was going to ask you that because not only have you written about zombies, but a lot of your vampires would be what people would categorize as maybe the viral type of vampire, where the vampirism spreads quickly.
Yes.
And so since you've done this research already, and when you look at the work you've done that's looks at a society's response to a vampire epidemic or a zombie epidemic, I wanted to ask you, looking at what we are dealing with right here and now, how are we doing?
It's funny. The people who aren't taking this seriously, the ones who continue to go out and socialize with their friends because, I'm not getting symptoms, they're the ones who actually would spread the plague. I mean, in a zombie movie, they'd be the ones, there's no problem out there. He'd get bitten and he'd be a zombie out there biting someone else. It's that model. There are people who just don't either get it or care, or they're so self-centered that restrictions become an inconvenience to them that they can't tolerate or won't tolerate. So they go and break quarantine, and I see it all the time. Those of us who are paying attention to the quarantine, and doing our best with it, are the ones, who are on a different side of that evolutionary survival of the fittest. Because, and a lot of times, the fittest is best defined as having some goddamn common sense.
Right.
The people without the goddamn common sense are the ones who are going to get it, and unfortunately, they often spread it.
All right, I'm pitching you a new zombie film or book, comic, graphic novel. It can infect everybody, but 70% of the people will recover within 14 days, but the other 30% are going to become flesh-eating monsters. Do those 70% keep going out and say, well, I'll probably recover. I probably will just be a ravenous flesh-eating monster for a few days, and then I'll be fine. So it's okay for me to go socialize.
The people who will go out are the ones who don't think it's really going to affect them. There's a kind of bizarre delusion of immortality that some people have, where they think that if there's a national disaster, just because they're them, it's not going to affect them. I don't feel sick. I don't know personally anyone who is sick. Therefore, it's exaggerated. And
are we made immune by some of the horror stories that we've read? Do we say, well, because it's not flesh-eating monsters, then it's probably not that bad?
No, I think a lot of it is because there's a lot more sociopathy in our society than people think. There are a lot more people who really believe the world revolves around them, and that whatever they want, they should be able to have. I think that's actually a bigger consideration than anything else. And also they're lazy and greedy. They want what they want, and it doesn't matter if it inconveniences someone else or endangers someone else. It's more. That's not something that's brand new. It's just we see more of it because of social media. But unfortunately, there's always been that.
Well, it's either the best timing ever or the worst timing ever. But you have this project coming out called Pandemica, if I'm pronouncing that right.
Pandemica, yeah. I've been doing. There's 4 issues of it out now. Let me grab. This is the Pandemica comic. There are 4 issues of it out now. The 5th issue, ironically, has been put on hold because of the global pandemic, which is kind of funny.
Go figure.
The company that distributes comics, Diamond, their employees are home. It's not an essential service. Comic books are not essential. At least I think they are, but clearly the government doesn't. So they're home, and that means the 5th issue is not coming out anytime soon, and the trade paperback collection is not coming anytime soon. But at the same time, I have to be somewhat amused by the irony of a global pandemic stopping the release of a global pandemic comic. And this comic idea, by the way, I've had this. I pitched this 2 years ago, so this isn't something in relation, as a response to what's going on out there. But boy, a lot of the government obfuscation and lack of cooperation that's going on in our world is already in the comic.
It's all predicted. In fact, I was rewatching V-Wars to get prepared for this, and I know that the TV show is different from your comic, but there were moments in the TV show that were eerie in how much they mirrored what's going on today. People saying, let's not get this information out because it will cause panic. Let's restrict that information even though we're pretty sure it's true. It was frightening. It was frightening, and that came out long before COVID-19 was hitting the newspapers.
Yeah, and it's based on books that were written in 2011 and 12.
Right.
So it's quite a bit of a while. But we also saw this coming. We saw SARS and MERS and other diseases that were coming through on a regular basis, getting more and more resistant to treatments. Because that's what diseases do. It's how they survive for hundreds of millions of years, because they've been able to adapt. It's a very frightening time for us. We should be able to react better to this, and we're not, and that's a little strange.
And yet, a lot of us, I'm trying to be optimistic here. A lot of us are doing what you and I are doing right here. We're figuring out ways to communicate remotely, people are staying home whenever I've had to go out to get food or something. There's a lot fewer cars. There's a lot fewer people.
Yeah.
It certainly seems like a lot of people are adhering to the recommendations. I wish it was more, but it seems like a lot of people are doing the right thing.
I do think it's the majority who are. It's just that there is a group that's big enough to be a danger to the rest who are not. And some people are unbelievably stubborn when it comes to this sort of thing.
Well, on a happier note, let's talk a little bit more in the time we have remaining about the undead, because far funnier to talk about the undead than people who might actually die because of a global pandemic that we're now experiencing. Tell me about writing monsters versus writing humans, and how one influences the other, and why the monster helps you write more about the human.
Well, most monster stories, and I'm going to use zombies as a good example for this, because most monster stories aren't about the monster. They're about people in extraordinary situations. So in the zombie story, yes, you have monsters. And when you write the monster part of it, depending on the type of story, you have to get inside its point of view. Well, zombie, standard mindless zombie, there's no point of view. Mm-hmm. I actually created one for my book, Dead of Night, where it turns out the consciousness of the person who became a zombie is still trapped in there, helplessly witnessing whatever its body does. I wrote that when my father-in-law was going through dementia, by the way. So it was kind of a metaphor of that. But most often when I write a monster, there's a corollary to some human desire, need, fear, something that drives that creature, hunger. And we can understand it because we are also driven by things. I mean, we act in a civilized way because we're in a civilized society, but we're one major catastrophe away from being barbarians again. The upside is we have that practice of being civilized. And so when you have the monster acting out of keeping with our ordinary rules and laws and behavioral ethics and so on, we can see that as what would happen if one of us became that extreme. So the monster becomes us in extreme. But we also get to be inside the head of the non-infected or non-human, non-monster character, where we see where they realize what this threat is. Often it's much a look inward as a look at the threat. So you've got the introspective quality within the story of them understanding what they might do under the same circumstances, or whether they have courage to respond. Do they have the generosity of spirit to risk to protect other people? All of these things we discover in crisis. We don't know these things about ourselves when things are happy and normal. So the monster allows us to, once introduced into a story, allows the characters to be able to really identify who they are, to rise to their, better angels and their worst devils by being pushed to extremes, way outside their comfort zone. That's why in a lot of disaster stories, the first thing that falls is the infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So that the people no longer have anyone to save them, and they no longer have the comfort of playing this affected role that we normally put on like a suit of clothes every day. That's stripped away. So you can be a captain of industry who's normally, you snap your fingers, people jump, but in a crisis, they might be the person least able to survive. Where some guy running a hot dog stand on the street who's had to figure everything out, find every penny in dollars, survive to pay it, to feed his kids, is so much more resourceful. That person may wind up rise to be a hero, but they never think they're a hero because they're not in that kind of a crisis. So that's why I like monster stories. They create a crisis framework for us to really explore the human dynamic under stress. And monsters of different types provoke different types of reactions, different types of requirements of resourcefulness in us. And so there's no real end to how many stories can be told dealing with monsters, because there's no end to the variations of human drama.
Because zombies tend to destroy a society, whereas a vampire would just infiltrate a society,
right.
Typically.
Yeah, and a werewolf is usually
living on the fringes of society.
Fringes of society. It's our inner self that we're dealing, like inner extremes. Ghost stories tend to be very personal. Each one has its own flavor to it.
Sure.
And something like a mummy becomes an adventure story, a culture clash story. Usually, their religious burial rites that we're screwing with, something like that. So there is always a subtext in there, and often many of them wired into most of really good horror.
A lot of the early vampire stories treated the vampire as an other, with very few exceptions that I can think of until sometime in the middle of the last century when the vampire started to become a central character. And you kind of
Right.
played both sides in some of your work. You
Yeah.
have a human side and you have a vampire side, and you're representing both of them. Was that a way for you to get away from this monster versus human dynamic and to tell a two sides of a coin story?
Yeah, because I don't like one-sided viewpoint stories. Just like if I was writing a story about somebody trying to take over the world, that person did not wake up and decide, "Hey, you're evil." That isn't how the process happens. What happens is a worldview evolves within them so powerful that they feel they need to impose it on the world around them, because often they think that's the way the world will work best. Sometimes it's psychopathy, sometimes sociopathy, sometimes it's religion or something, and sometimes it's greed. Sometimes it's just the need to destroy too. But there's a lot of different flavors of it. When I write stories of monsters, I want the monsters to be very three-dimensional. I want them to have reasons to do what they do, and sometimes even consequences for what they do. I mean, the monster shouldn't always just. It isn't like Godzilla just stomping through a city and then leaving again. That was a good movie the first time, but after the 10th movie, he's still stomping through a city. They had to give him monsters to fight so that there would be a degree of threat. I like having the monster not be completely invulnerable, but I do like them being enigmatic, so that, like in the novel I just finished, Ink, the monster in that story is not one directly from folklore. He feeds on memories, and he does that by stealing tattoos that are tied with our deepest memories. So by brushing you, the tattoo begins to fade on you, appear in his body, and he relives the most intense memories, like the memory of a dead child or something like that, and feeds on it. But I went in that book. I have a whole series of flashbacks that follow him from childhood to explain the evolution, not to justify, but explain the evolution of why he thinks he's doing what it's just right for him. It's his nature. He's not defining himself as a monster, so to speak, because this is the nature he has. Therefore, he feels justified in his actions. In V-Wars, the character of Michael Fane, created Blood Nation because he was no longer Homo sapiens sapiens, which is what we are. He's Homo sapiens vampiri. He's a different species, and therefore not bound by our laws and rules. But he doesn't know what that means because he's also partly human. So I get to play with the human dynamic and its evolution into something else, and also the point of view of a monster and why it justifies what it does in a way that doesn't make it wrong by its own standards, just by our standards. And that allows you to do moral conflict, religious conflict, psychological, political conflict. Allows you to play with all those elements as well.
That's beautiful. I'm glad you're doing that with your work. It gives us a richer texture of characters to look at.
Well, it's also the types of villains I like reading. I've never liked the mustache twirling villain who's just bad. It's like, why? In the James Bond novels, especially in the movies, at the end of each movie, usually the villain will capture James Bond and then explain his entire rationale for why he's trying to conquer the world. First of all, that would never happen. The hero almost never gets to meet the villain and have that conversation, nor would the villain want to. So I'd rather tell stories with flashbacks so that we see the evolution of the villain into that worldview. That makes it more realistic, even though you're doing fantastical creatures.
This is totally off topic. I have a friend who attempted to take Richard III and not rewrite it, but reorder it. And by putting the scenes in a different order, he found a way to make Richard III be a much more sympathetic character. You see why he became so bitter and angry if you just read it in a different order. It was a brilliant way to take a classic play and apply that logic to it.
I had a history teacher once that did something similar with King John and Richard the Lionheart. Richard Lionheart, was spent almost no time in England. He was off fighting the Crusades and doing things around the country, leaving his brother to run the country, and then comes back and expects his brother just to give up the crown again. And that's an unrealistic thing. I mean, Lionheart thought his worldview was right. He was out doing what he thought was right. But King John was always made as a villain in all the Robin Hood stories and Crusade stories, was also trying to actually do the job that his brother wasn't doing. Mm-hmm. So he's actually a little more sympathetic than the movies. He's more sympathetic in history than the movies make in fiction.
I love those rereadings of classic stories that we think we know who the good and the bad guy is, and someone says, what if you twist it this way? Suddenly Karate Kid looks not such a black and white story anymore. I was like,
yeah.
I never thought about it from that perspective, because we're supposed to look at it through a certain lens. That's the way the story is constructed.
Perspective is an interesting thing. When you try to step inside another character's skin, you begin to understand the world as they see it, which makes you able to write all the characters in a novel from unique perspectives if you as a writer are doing your homework.
I have just a couple more questions. Then I think we're even gone over a little bit of our time allotment here. But I wanted to ask you, what do vampire stories tell us about ourselves?
That depends on who's telling the story. I mean, original vampire stories were a way of exploring rape, the culture of rape, because vampires take what we don't want taken. Like, as I mentioned earlier, a third of the world's vampires drink blood. A third feed on flesh, what are called necrophages, and a third, maybe a little more than a third, feed on some essence, whether it's breath, sexual essence, faith. There's one vampire in the Middle East that feeds on faith. All these different types of vampires that feed on different things, and each one has its own motivations, its own structure. So when we're telling these stories, we get to explore. Best way to put this, we get to explore the different points of view that make something like this rational. A great example. You've heard of, what sudden infant death syndrome is, right?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Okay. So SIDS,
cheery topic we're getting into here, though.
Cheery, but we are talking about vampires. When people were in that era, a few hundred years ago, they put a healthy kid to bed, the kid would die. They wouldn't know why the kid died. There's no marks on him, no disease. Nobody got in there. It was, maybe a second floor with, no easy access. So it was impossible for the people of the time to accept that God would just allow a healthy child to die. So there must be something that hurt the child who was not God. And so so they start looking at monsters. Well, a creature that comes in silently at night and sucks the life out of a child and leaves it cold and dead, that's a kind of vampire. That's a way for explaining this phenomenon. And not only was it a way that made sense, because the people would, in those eras, would go to the person most learned in their town, which is almost always the village priest, and the person would say, you must have sinned, so say these prayers, do these acts of contritions, maybe buy this charm, and it won't happen again. And since SIDS rarely strikes the same family more than once, those people who became more devout would in fact not have it happen to them, reinforcing their faith. So it actually created a way for them to balance their cosmic world, cosmic view, because now you have something that is the anti-God, the demon, the monster in the dark, but you have a way of preventing that. And it allows you to believe in God without hating him for the child's death, while at the same time accepting that a monster needs to be there in order for the world to have balance. So that's one of the ways in which we created vampires or viewed vampires. Another way over time is vampires reflect, like in the especially in the 20th and early 21st century, when you had the more romantic vampires. I think they were a way for us to continue believing in demigods without calling them demigods. They were immortals who were beautiful but tragic and complex, and they had difficulty adapting to the world as a god or as a human. So we could feel tragic feel pity for them. At the same time, we admire them and aspire to be them. And I think we kind of like having that in our cosmology, the demigods, the complex pantheons of spirits. For me, vampires are not good guys. I don't like the romanticized vampire. I like my vampires monstrous, scary, old school horror vampires, and they tend to represent more of the concept of rape or abuse, and different writers.
They take without consent for themselves, and they give nothing back.
Right. Yeah, and my friend Anne Rice, I mean, when she does her Lestat books, Lestat is good guy, bad guy. She hasn't quite landed on where he is, which is the point of that series of stories. Each writer has a different take on what the vampire means to them. Stephanie Meyer, Forbidden Love, with the Twilight books. Everyone has a different thing, but my vampires are definitely not good guys. I like them evil because I like people to have to go up against an evil that is extremely powerful and apparently unbeatable, but they then have to, either through acquisition of knowledge or cooperation or discovering courage, be able to confront and defeat that evil. It allows us to have also to write to have stories that have a better third act than real life often does. You can't go drive a stake through the heart of a child abuser, tempting as it is.
You remind me of something Donald Glut said to me in an interview where he said, I hate vampire stories that begin with, forget everything you know about vampires. He's like, no, I want my vampires to hate the sunlight, and I want them to be evil, and I want them to bite necks.
Well, the funny thing about that is I'm actually only partly in line with that, because I do want vampires to be evil, but I do want them to be folklorically based. So vampires and folklore, except for the Chinese...
the jumping vampires?
The hopping vampires, they're the only ones that fear light. All of the other vampires don't. Mm-hmm. Vampires don't fear the cross. That was made up by Bram Stoker, who was Irish Catholic. Vampires are not killed by stakes. That was made up for the movies, because even Dracula wasn't killed by a stake. He was stabbed with a kukri knife and a Bowie knife. Stakes were used to hold the vampire down while the head was then cut off and the whole ritual of exorcism performed. Werewolves are not killed by silver bullets either. They're killed by any bullet. Anything that would kill a wolf would kill a werewolf. So I like my monsters in my fiction to be closer to the folkloric versions, because there's a little more interesting attrition in terms of the story, the characters in the story, because they think a cross and a stake is going to stop a vampire, and oops, it does not, which allows the reader to be a little shocked, but this is the folkloric version of the vampire. In fact, my first 3 novels, Ghost Road Blues and its 2 sequels, the vampire subtype in that was one from Belarus, and it's a great bit of folklore. If a werewolf dies, it comes back as a vampire. That's a really great bit of folklore. So I use that as the basis for my monster. There had been a werewolf in town. He'd been killed and buried, but now 20 years later, he's coming back as a kind of spiritual presence.
It varies village to village. Sometimes if you're a wizard or if you're a witch, you can die and come back as it seems like you could just keep trading up from wizard to werewolf to vampire until you get whatever folkloric mythical creature you want to be.
Sure, and there's a lot of crossovers too. Like the Lugaru in Haiti is an old woman who tears off her skin and flies around as a ball of light, like a will-o'-the-wisp, but she also drains life. So she's a will-o'-the-wisp vampire. There are witch vampires, there are zombie vampires, there are werewolf witches. There's all these different interesting combinations, because village to village, town to town, culture to culture, as populations moved back then, you had that whisper down the lane version of stories, where somebody who told a story here, like a great example is the Liho in Russia. The Liho, the villagers who believe in the Liho, this towering one-eyed giant, believe it's their monster, but it's the exact story out of Ulysses. It's the exact story, but they don't remember that it was a Greek. Who knows which Greek brought that to that part of rural Russia? But the Liho is the exact story. Killed with blinded the same way and everything. But they think it's their monster.
I found that really interesting when I started reading about the American vampire panic and how they never used the word vampire, but yet all their practices, everything they did as a result of what they were scared of, was an exact mirror of what was happening in Eastern Europe. So somehow this hand talked to this hand, and they said, okay, we heard this works over in Eastern Europe. We're going to start doing it here in northwestern New England, northeastern New England.
Well, yeah, I mean, don't forget that America is populated by immigrants from other places, and they brought their cultures and their beliefs with them. That's the basis for American Gods by Neil Gaiman, of people bringing their gods with them.
Oh, sure.
And other belief systems, and those belief systems get into collision with one another, and they blend and change, and they become something else. Here, you can see it in a lot of the ghost tales in the Appalachians, which started out as folk songs brought over from Irish and Scottish immigrants from the 1800s. Their folk songs became the folk legends in Appalachia. And then people in Appalachia believe that they're ghost stories that actually happen somewhere there, but actually not. They're folk songs, and they may even have been based on a belief at some point. She Moved Through the Fair is a great example. There are a lot of people who believe that was an actual ghost story. It was actually written as a song, but people believe it was a ghost story first.
Well, since we're kind of already on this topic, do you think that there's folklore that we look back on and point to, but are interpreting incorrectly? Are there any real popular myths about the undead or about monsters that were a folkloric belief, but we are viewing it completely through the wrong lens?
Yes, werewolves. Perfect example. First off, the whole thing about a werewolf, it's not, they don't just turn into a wolf on the 3 days, the full moon. They can turn into a werewolf anytime they want. And they turn into wolves. They don't turn into half man, half wolf things. That was a construct. When there was a story called, I just read an introduction to it, The Wolf Leader by Alexander Dumas. It was a werewolf novel written by the guy who wrote Three Musketeers. And I just wrote the introduction for it. But in the illustrations, it's a wolf standing on his hind legs. But in the stories, the person becomes a wolf. And if you look at, there are hundreds of transcripts of trials in France, Italy, and Germany of people arrested for werewolfism. And if you read the accounts, rarely did they turn into an actual wolf. They were cunning, they were murderous, sometimes cannibalistic, and they often hid their prey. Now, if we thought about those elements today, what would we think? Serial killer.
Yeah.
Right. But that wasn't a concept then. So our understanding of what a serial killer is, looking back, informs the understanding of why people thought werewolves existed, because somebody acted like a ravening, flesh-eating beast.
Well, you've given me $1 million idea. Instead of serial killer podcasts, I'm going to do werewolf podcasts, and it's just going to be about real serial killers, but we'll call them werewolves.
Yeah. That would be a pretty novel way of doing it. I like it.
Well, Jonathan, I've taken up too much of your time already. Thank you so much for joining us and doing this today. I hope you're staying safe and staying inside and avoiding the pandemic that is delaying Pandemica from coming out.
Yeah, that's one of the things about being a writer is, I'm a self-employed writer. I live at home. So my lifestyle hasn't changed a whole lot, other than I'm not going to conventions. Right. But, I get up every day and I'm already at work.
Do you have any other projects you talked about ink? Is there any other things coming out that you want to tell the public about?
Yeah, actually, I'm just about to start. In fact, when we end this call, I'll be starting two projects. One is the new Joe Ledger thriller. This will be the 12th in the Joe Ledger series.
He's a very popular character of yours, yeah.
He is. He's a lot of fun to write, too. So I'll be writing the 12th in that series, but also I'll be writing the first in a new series for Audible called Bewilderness. And it's a science fiction horror mashup. A team tries to open a doorway to a parallel Earth so they can basically strip its resources for us. Mm-hmm. But the process is imperfect, and it collides hundreds of different versions of the Earth into one. And some of those parts of those other Earths have monsters in them. And so I'll be writing that. Ink comes out this year. Also, Lost Roads, the 7th in my Rotten Ruin series, about growing up 14 years after the zombie apocalypse, comes out in August. And got a whole bunch of stuff coming out. Actually, the latest thing that's just published, though, is this. Laurel K. Hamilton, who did the really wonderful Nita Blake Vampire Hunter series, she and William McCaskey did an anthology. I have a Joe Ledger story in that. it's dystopian stories that end well.
Oh.
So that's why it's called Fantastic Hope, because it basically, no matter how dark the story is, it has to end on a somewhat upbeat note, which is a challenge because she mostly tapped guys like me who write stories where the good guys may win, but they're a mess too.
But at what cost?
So yeah. So I got to write something that had a more upbeat ending. So it was kind of fun.
Well, all right. Well, it's a light in these dark times.
Well, thanks. And also, since I will be home, I'll be doing things like I'll be doing my Writers Coffee House online now via Zoom. So we can have up to 100 people joining on that. The next one will be Sunday noon to 3 Pacific time. And I'm launching all the classes I would normally teach at writers conferences. I'm going to be doing online, so that's going to be a bunch of fun.
Just because people might be watching this, and it might be a couple weeks down the line. Is the writing class is a regular repeating thing, or the coffee house is a regular repeating thing?
Our coffee house is the first Sunday of every month, noon to 3 Pacific time.
Very good.
Normally hosted at a Mysterious Galaxy bookstore, but they're closed for now. But my writing classes, I'll be advertising those on my social media pages. The first one should be in about 2 or 3 weeks, and it's going to be my writing fight and action scenes, one of my favorite topics.
Excellent.
But we'll be doing a whole series of classes and also doing virtual panel discussions with some of my writer friends. The sort of panels we would normally do at a conference, we'll do online.
We'll put a bunch of links to all that stuff below where you're seeing this video right now.
Oh, nice.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. I can't thank you enough for doing this. Good luck, and please stay inside.
All right, you too.
Take care.
This was fun. Thank you.
Bye. I want to say thank you once more to Jonathan Maberry for being the first guest on the Toothpickings web interviews. We're going to have more of these that are going to be coming out in the coming weeks. There's going to be some really dynamic guests. I think you're going to like what you find here, especially if you find vampires and the undead to be a fascinating subject. We're going to talk about all those things and then whatever else just happens to come up in the course of the interview. Jonathan, I want to be clear about this. He did not ask for any kind of plugs or publicity or anything. He did this interview just because he knows people out there are trapped in their homes and need some sort of diversion. But even so, I'm going to put some links down below to some of the projects he's working on and some of the activities he has going on that you can interface with and you can interact with. I think if you spend 5 minutes looking around at some of those links, you're going to find something that tickles your fancy, because Jonathan Maberry is a very prolific writer, and he's got something that appeals to you. Anyway, until next time, thank you again. We will have more of these coming out soon, so stay tuned.